Welcome, everyone, to the Cooperation Science Network live stream. The Cooperation Science Network is a group of scholars who span many disciplines, and we come together to understand the fundamental principles that drive cooperation and also the forces that can compromise it. Today, we're really excited to have with us evolutionary biologist and psychologist Nichola Raihani. She's going to be talking with us about her new book, The Social Instinct: How Cooperation Shaped the World. Nichola, it is a pleasure to have you here with us today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Athena. Thanks for the invite. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too. All right, I have to start out just being honest with you. Your book, I kind of wish that I wrote it. It's so good. And you just you span like all these different systems from, human sharing to non-human animals and insects and cells. And you just like cover so much territory. So I thought it was really awesome.
That's very nice of you to say. Likewise, I loved your book too. So thank you for saying that. And, it was great. It was great to be able to read a book like yours and to learn from that on the way.
Well, thank you. The other thing that was really impressive about your book, I have to say, is how it spanned from very scholarly to very accessible, and striking that balance, I think, is really challenging, but you managed to do that. And I'm kind of wondering, why did you decide you wanted to write a book that would speak to both of those audiences at the same time?
Yeah, I think cooperation is one of those things that's sort of fundamentally misunderstood in the public, and the idea of why individuals cooperate. And I think there's still a lot of talk of individuals doing things for the good of the group or the good of the species. And so partly I wanted to explain some of the evolutionary thinking around how and why cooperation evolves, and how we can use the gene's eye view and this concept of individual level selection to understand cooperation that we see in the natural world. But it was also really important to me that the book would be accurate and that it would reflect the latest science that and things that we know about cooperation. I guess probably a lot of people, when they read popular science books, particularly if you're in the field, it can be pretty frustrating to read books where you feel like they don't accurately represent the state of the art, or where they are maybe they're relying on science that we know hasn't replicated or is out of date. And so it was quite important to me, and I hope that I achieved this, although I guess I'll be told if not, that I wrote something that was actually rigorous.
I'm not sure if we've lost you or I'm out of the stream. I'm going to bring on some support though here with us. Jesse Ayers, why don't we have a little chat while we're waiting for the technical problems to sort themselves out? We kind of have had a bit of a tech challenge today in general with getting things started here. But so Jesse, can you tell us your thoughts when you had the chance to read Nichola's book, The Social Instinct?
Yeah, I really love this book. And so I read both your book and her book very closely together. And I feel like there was a lot of really good things in both of these books, and they played really well off of each other. And, being your former graduate student now, I've had a lot of time to kind of see the way that you think, and you think about these big cooperation issues. And I feel like Nichola's book did a really great job of just bringing together so many of the things that we've talked about, you've taught about in all of your classes, about basically just how fundamental cooperation is to all different aspects of the world, whether we're talking about single cell organisms, we're talking about human groups. So I just love the book.
We're just gushing about your book. So
I really don't know what happened. It may have been, sometimes I have an issue with my Mac, but I don't know, it just decided to turn off and on again. Sorry about that. Anyway, I was saying it was important the book, it was rigorous, and that it could be a useful thing for both people in the general public and also people in the field to hopefully find something in that they, that they didn't know before or that they found useful for them.
Absolutely. And, as you were talking about it, it struck me that there are these sort of two conceptions, I think, out there in the general public. One of that, well, the research in evolutionary biology shows that selfishness is the thing, right? So there's like a stream of that. And then there's like the other stream, which is a sort of naive cooperationism, if I could put it that way. And I think that there's a real place for, looking at cooperation in a really rigorous way and in a, multiple systems, multiple species kind of way. And there hasn't really been that stream of sort of science communication around that, that like rigorous approach to understanding how cooperation functions in evolutionary terms and then concretely in the world.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess like if the books that are out there that I think sit close to this on the shelf would be things like Sapiens, which is basically a story of how humans came to be cooperative, but doesn't really address the question of why in any detail. And then you have other books like The Selfish Gene, where where there really is a focus on how you can get this evolution of cooperative and social behavior, starting from a fundamentally selfish gene, and which remains, a hugely important and influential book, but which is basically, it was published in the 80s. I mean, things have moved on a lot since The Selfish Gene was published. And I think it doesn't really also go into those details that so interest me, which is around how psychology affects people's social behavior and animals' social behavior, and what are the mechanisms, the psychological mechanisms that underpin social behaviors. And so I guess I was trying to do a bit of a mashup between those different things in a way to have this kind of holistic view of how cooperation shaped the world, like what it means to be a social species, what we have in common with other social species, and what sets us apart.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that you absolutely succeeded in pulling all those threads together and writing a book that is, both accessible and scholarly, which is quite a feat. So really impressive. So can you give us maybe an example from your book about a system where we see cooperation that might be kind of surprising for people? Like what are some species or some, entities that cooperate that are cool or surprising?
I think, so for me, cooperation is amazing because it's so ubiquitous that we take it completely for granted. So, when you look in the mirror and you're seeing yourself as a sort of a discrete entity, this whole individual we see when we look in the mirror is actually a remarkable feat of cooperation. So just like every other living thing on the planet, we are made of genes that are cooperating inside genomes and cells that are working together to make this unified thing that we perceive as being an individual. If you take your morning commute, for example, I commute in by train now to my office at UCL, and every single journey that I take on the train is a remarkable testament to just how cooperative a species we are. So, the fact that not only that these trains and platforms exist in the first place, but the fact that I can expect reasonably to arrive at my destination in one piece, unharmed, despite I'm getting on this very crowded train carriage with lots and lots of strangers, is also, if we take a step back and think about it, quite remarkable. And it's something that if, as Sarah Blaffer-Hardy famously remarked, that if that train was filled with chimpanzees, it would be quite different when it arrived in Euston Station in the morning, right? So it would not be a pretty sight at all. So I think we see cooperation is basically everywhere. It's all around us. We take it, often completely for granted, but it's also occurring in these quite sort of esoteric species and maybe things that we've never heard of. So things like cleaner fish that I've worked on, that live on coral reefs and that offer a cleaning service to all the other fish that live on the reef. We call them the clients. And so cleaner fish, for example, are cooperative because they give a cleaning service to the clients, and they remove ectoparasites and dead skin from the surface of the client's skin.
So it's kind of like within the, underwater spa for fish or something. And they get cleaned up and
I call it like the cleaning station. So you can see cleaner fish basically hold these small territories. We call them cleaning stations. But in a way, you can think of them as being like the hairdressers of the coral reef. And all the clients kind of visit their favorite hairdresser, their favorite cleaning station, and they go there and get this nice treatment. And it seems like in some ways, this is a very nice example of cooperation, because the cleaner fish, even though you would think this might be quite harmonious, there's actually this conflict of interest between the cleaner fish and their clients, because even though the cleaner fish will eat ectoparasites, what they prefer to eat is the client's living tissues. And so here we have a really nice underwater example of cooperation occurring between strangers, where we have one party that's tempted to cheat. So the cleaner fish is tempted to cheat, and the client has to find ways to encourage that cleaner fish to feed against its preference and to provide a good cleaning service. And we see that this does happen underwater. Clients have tricks up their sleeves to encourage cleaner fish to behave nicely. And so we see cooperation everywhere.
Yeah.
Really.
And it sounds like you also have a great conceit for a screenplay for a horror movie about the spa, where it's they want to clean you, but really they would prefer to eat your flesh. So I think there's definitely some potential there for future development.
Puts a new spin on those foot spas with the fish that people used to go to for cleaning your feet.
Absolutely. So, Nichola, we did a little poll on Twitter before, in advance of our live stream, to ask people about sort of how they saw cooperation across systems. So let's pull this up and we can have a little chat about it. So we asked people here about how broadly they think the principles of cooperation apply across systems. And basically we had, 2/3 of people say any living system, and about 1/3 say that cooperation applies also to non-living systems. What are your thoughts on this? How broadly do you think cooperation applies?
Well, I'm glad that no one put only humans, because so basically it seems like that the poll is pretty accurate. I mean, my sense is that I think cooperation is largely something which occurs within living systems, but I can see why some people might have ticked that it applied to non-living systems as well, because I think what we're seeing increasingly now, in particular in our own species, is that we are cooperating often with autonomous systems, so forms of artificial intelligence that we outsource tasks to, or that we rely on, things like driverless cars or smart electricity meters. And so I can sort of see actually that in some ways these same kinds of principles and the same kinds of mechanisms that are important to sustain cooperation. So things like, do I trust this thing? Is it competent? Is it going to do a good job? Should I choose that thing or that thing? So, partner choice mechanisms, we're also applying those now to the kinds of interactions we have with non-living entities. And so I probably agree actually with I think it was the bottom one where it said it applies to living and non-living systems.
Yeah, I guess there's also the question of, non-living systems that are, maybe institutions. So yes, they might have humans in them, but then you have structures, right, relationships, and even decision rules about how things need to be done that are in a way separate from the humans that make them up. And those entities could also cooperate with each other.
Yeah, that's true. So yeah, things like organizations or corporations or nation states can also we wouldn't think of them as being living systems, but yes, you're right, they can, by virtue of the people that make them up, they can interact with one another, and they can have these sort of higher level interactions that involve cooperation and punishment and partner choice and all these things that we think are important among individuals as well.
Yeah. So we're going to take a few questions from the audience now, and I just want to remind everybody, please type in your questions if you have questions for us as we go, or comments. If you have something to say about the conversation, we'd love to hear it and pull you into the conversation. And in case you haven't yet, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the Cooperation Science Network. All right. So first question we have, Nichola, is Pam Winfrey. She's asking about, when we were talking about the cleaner fish, and Pam's asking, what do you call that type of relationship? Do we call it symbiotic? Is there another word that we use to describe that relationship? And what are the, what are the criteria for how we decide what word to use to describe these kinds of cooperative relationships?
It's largely semantic. I mean, you could describe the cleaner fish client system as a kind of symbiosis. We tend to call it a mutualism. So mutualism basically referring to interactions that occur between members of different species that cooperate with one another to both species benefit. So, but yeah, I mean, you see symbioses are very, very similar, where you have interacting members of species that interact with one another to the joint benefit of both parties. Yeah.
Great. Okay, we have another question. This one is from Cristiano. He's asking whether, the fact that we humans have culture and cultural evolution in particular, does that make human cooperation very different from cooperation in other systems? Or do we see things like culture and cultural evolution in other species?
So we do see culture in other species, and we see cultural evolution in other species as well. But I do think that the cultural evolution of norms and rules and systems that codify how we cooperate, and the kinds of things that we decide collectively are acceptable or desirable or worthy, virtuous, and things like this, do actually change the nature of human cooperation in relation to what we see in non-human species. So things like concepts of fairness, that is a very human concept that's culturally evolved, and actually is quite variable across societies, what people consider to be fair versus unfair. And we really don't see those similar concepts of fairness outside of humans. So and the ways that impinges then on the way that we cooperate and interact with one another, it can be quite profound, right? So I think that these kinds of culturally evolved norms and rules that do change the way that humans cooperate, and they change because they introduce these new concepts around how we ought to cooperate, and what is favored and what's frowned upon and what's approved of within our societies.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it does create a totally different landscape then for how natural selection can operate. So it changes a lot of fundamental things that create new opportunities.
Yeah, so just taking one example, there's one very popular concept in evolutionary biology, which is thought to be a fundamental mechanism for supporting cooperation, which is called indirect reciprocity. And indirect reciprocity is basically when individuals are helped because they helped another individual. So they get a good reputation, and as a consequence, they are then more likely to be helped themselves. And it seems like this concept of indirect reciprocity, or this mechanism, if you like, is probably very rare or even absent outside humans, because it fundamentally relies on our being able to agree on what behaviors or what actions should give you a good reputation, and what behaviors and what actions should give you a bad reputation. So, for example, it's not as simple as just helpful individuals should be helped. We know that from these theoretical models that actually the rules that are stable are more nuanced rules around things like individuals that help good individuals get a good reputation, but if you help bad individuals, you get a bad reputation. But already we're starting to get into complexity here, that without some kind of shared understanding around what do we think is good, what do we think is bad, how do we agree on this stuff, you can't really get to evolve these kinds of mechanisms in a stable way outside of humans. I just don't think that there's really very good evidence for those kinds of mechanisms supporting cooperation outside of our species.
Do you think that's partially because we are relying on memory and sort of meta representations and shared representations and things like that, that there's not much evidence for in other species?
I think memory is part of it, but I don't think that's the major limiting cognitive factor that prevents us seeing things like this outside humans. I think that more important are things like language and concepts of what someone like Mike Tomasello would call shared intentionality, where we're basically able to agree on what we are doing and what we're trying to achieve, and we're able to have kind of conversations and about what we think is praiseworthy, what we think is blameworthy, and we have these kinds of collective processes that help us to come to these agreements. And I just think those things are very particular to our species, and they are culturally evolved, and we just don't really see that those kinds of meta level mechanisms supporting cooperation in non-human species, in part because of the cognition that's required to sort of invent them and sustain them.
So it's information processing capacity, but not necessarily just like raw memory ability for individuals.
Yeah, I think it's more than memory. I think working memory has a lot to do with it. So working memory being a bit like it's sort of linked to executive function, like how many different pieces of information can you hold active in your mind at the same time? What can you integrate those bits of information? Some people think of working memory as being a bit like apps on your phone, like how many apps can you have open at the same time, and can those apps talk to each other? And that, you know, when we look at non-human species and what their working memory capacity is compared to the working memory capacity of humans, it's really quite different. And I think there is something quite fundamentally different about being able to, for example, understand another individual's mental state and understand how your behavior, if I do this or if I do that, how will you then update what you think about me? Like how will that affect your impression of me and my reputation? And doing those things involves you having lots of those kind of apps, if you like, open at the same time, and being able to manipulate them and integrate them in a way that's actually computationally quite demanding. And there's just not really that much good evidence that non-human species are able or have that kind of working memory capacity. So I think there are some sort of hardware or software, I don't know what you would call it, but there are some kind of constraints that are cognitive constraints that I think will limit the potential for some of the more sophisticated forms of cooperation or mechanisms that underpin cooperation.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, we're getting some awesome questions coming in. We're going to switch gears for a minute, though, and bring in Abe Gibson. I promise we'll come back to some of those excellent questions in a little bit. But so right now we'll bring Abe Gibson on to chat with us a little bit about the historical context of this. So Abe is a historian of science at the University of Texas, San Antonio. Abe, it is awesome to have you here on the show with us. So yeah, would you tell us what did you think of this book, and what do you think of the historical context of this book, and sort of what it adds to our thinking about cooperation across systems?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. First off, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here and an honor to speak with Dr. Raihani. I agree with you and Dr. Ayers that this is a great book, and it's especially useful to a historian of science or a historian of biology like me, who is interested in the history of cooperation science, but may not have the scientific background. So, congratulations on a wonderful achievement. Let me also say that I thought you did a great job explaining the value of cooperation to just about every type of enterprise that one can possibly imagine. As you write in the book, quote, "The history of life is a history of cooperation," close quote. I was especially intrigued by your suggestion that we, quote, "look sideways," close quote, and study other social creatures rather than looking backward at our recent ancestry. And so, can you say more about the benefits of looking sideways and how exactly studying cooperative behavior in other species can help us understand cooperative behavior in humans?
Sure. Yeah, nice to speak to you as well. Yeah, so I think there is this temptation, because we are great apes and we have these other great ape cousins that live on this planet with us. I think there is a temptation when we are looking for analogues of the kinds of behaviors that we think are special in our own species to look to our nearest neighbors on the evolutionary tree of life. So it's very tempting to kind of first of all start looking at whether we see these things in chimpanzees, in bonobos, in gorillas, in orangutans. And I think a lot of the time that can be very valuable. Like we have a shared evolutionary history with those species. We have a lot in common. But I think part of what an approach like that can miss is that it's not only evolutionary similarity or proximity on the evolutionary tree of life that affects whether we expect to see similarities in behaviors among species. It's also related to the social ecology of the species and whether species actually have to solve the same kinds of social challenges in their day-to-day life as one another, which will also predict whether they have things in common. And so when I say we look sideways, what I mean is we should actually not only be blinkered in that way. We shouldn't only look at the other great apes, but we should also look at species that live lives like we do, that live in extended family groups, like lots of other cooperatively breeding species do. So things like meerkats and ants and mole rats and babblers and all these other species that we know have very similar breeding systems to us. We can probably learn a lot about our social behavior from looking at those species. And we can look at species like the cleaner fish, where we know that, a key part of a cleaner fish's daily life is interacting with strangers, with individuals it doesn't know, it's never met, it might never meet again. And, that's hugely important for us in our societies as well. So, and by looking at cleaner fish, we actually can see, for example, that lots of the same mechanisms that we use to sustain cooperation with strangers in our societies are also the same kinds of things that we see in cleaner fish. So it's things like punishment and partner choice and things like that. So I think there's a lot of value to be gained from thinking about social ecology and the challenges that species face, and not just do they sit near us on the tree of life.
I'm going to pop in here with a question that we have from the audience that is kind of relevant to this issue. So, Nichola, you were talking a lot about the sort of similar social contexts, and Dr. Jessica here is asking about what's the relevance here of brain structure and function to cooperation? Is that something that we should be considering sort of in a phylogenetic perspective as well, or is a focus on kind of the social ecology and physical ecology a better place to focus?
Look, I think both are important, but I don't think and I don't think this is what the question is, but basically you can have species that have what you might call very simple cognition, and they are still exhibiting very rich forms of cooperation. So, or you just have to look at an ant society and see the kinds of behaviors that go on inside those colonies. So things like suicide to protect the colony. They have lots of very sophisticated mechanisms that are to do with protecting the colony from disease. So we know that ants, for example, will socially distance from the colony if they know that they've been infected with a fungus that could potentially endanger their relatives. They form these kind of special intensive care units where if a fungus or some kind of pathogen is introduced into the colony, then the queen and the workers that are associated with looking after the queen and the brood will sequester themselves deeper into the colony to ensure that those very important individuals are protected. And we see lots and lots of very sophisticated behaviors like this that are very cooperative, that, you know, and especially now in pandemic times, are very reminiscent of the kind of things that we have done in our societies to try to, for example, protect one another, but that are achieved by very different cognitive mechanisms. And so there's really no kind of forethought on the part of the ants, or they're not kind of sitting down and thinking, well, we've got a pathogen here, so you guys should go and do this and we'll do that. These things are probably much more instinctive, if you like, or are based on not very sort of overt forms of cognition. In the book, I basically make this distinction between behavior and cognition using an analogy which I call the destination and the journey. And basically this kind of pops up again and again in the book, which is that lots and lots of species can reach the same behavioral destination. So they can reach the same destination of being cooperative, of being able to deal with pathogens, or being able to protect themselves from predators. They can reach these same destinations, but they often will take quite different cognitive journeys to get there. And so the way that, say, a human or a chimpanzee might solve a cooperative problem and the way that an ant might solve it might be quite different cognitively, even if they do both get to kind of that same behavioral destination.
Yeah, so essentially convergent evolution, but of cooperative behaviors, where you can see similar kinds of things with different underlying evolutionary trajectories and mechanisms. Is that the idea?
Yeah, and also, like, really just to emphasize that the point that really sophisticated cooperation doesn't have to rely on extremely sophisticated cognition. Like, you can get there without being a particularly brainy species.
Yeah. It also seems like, with social insects in particular, there's almost a collective level of information processing that's going on. So like each of the ants, for example, are almost like acting like little nodes in a broader information processing network. So even just the process, of gathering information and integrating it is itself quite different.
Yeah, totally. And also, just to kind of go back to that point, like one thing I do think about humans in a way is that, there's this idea that the fancier the cognition you have, the better the cooperative outcomes you can achieve. But I think there are so many examples in humans where our cognition kind of gets in the way of us achieving a good cooperative outcome. So one really good example of this is this idea of no good deed goes unpunished, where, we actually, a lot of the time, humans will, if someone's doing something overtly cooperative, we will maybe ridicule them for it. I mean, like, everyone kind of, the vegans are always like the target of these kinds of jokes, where we call this do-gooder derogation, basically. But we will query their motives, we will maybe withhold reputation benefits, we will basically fundamentally disincentivize these kinds of different cooperative actions. And that's because of the cognition we have, where basically we are able to look under the hood and to try to infer the reasons why people do things they do, and to suspect that maybe people that are doing good things are doing it for self-interested reasons and not for other regarding reasons. And so we see actually that I actually think a lot of the time cognition for us gets in the way of achieving cooperative outcomes. It isn't always something which helps us to get there.
Right. Great. Abe, do you want to jump in with any other questions for Nichola while we have you?
Yeah, absolutely. This has been a great conversation. I've learned a lot. I wrote down the phrase social ecology. I find that rich and evocative. I'm sure I'm going to borrow that. Yes. So I do have a question. I think it's related to what we've been talking about, Dr. Raihani. Several times throughout your book, you return to the image of life as a nested hierarchy or a Russian doll, as you put it. I think this is a very helpful metaphor, but I do have a question. Should we conceive of cooperation as a universal law permeating every level of this Russian doll, or does cooperation look different at different levels?
Okay, great question. So, yeah, in the book, I mean, I'm not the first person to use this analogy, but it's a really helpful way to think about levels of cooperation. And I use this idea of the Russian doll, like you say, to illustrate how you can get genes cooperating with one another to form this next Russian doll, this what we think of as being a cell, and then cells maybe work together to form another layer, which is a new transition, a new kind of individual, which we think of as being a whole organism, like I am and you are, and that plant behind me is, and things like that. And sometimes some people also think you can transition up again, and say with social insect colonies, you can have collectives, which actually you can think of as being a new kind of individual, a new evolutionary invention. So I think that the thing that happens at each of those, what we call major evolutionary transitions, is that in order for that transition to happen, and in order for those new kinds of individual to be invented, if you like, by evolution, you have to align the interests of the parts that make up the what's inside that Russian doll, if you like. And so that involves, at all these levels of life, it will involve suppressing competition between those parts and ensuring that they are incentivized essentially to act in the collective interest to the common good and not against one another. So we see that the genes inside my body, for example, for the most part, do have a collective interest in my being able to survive and being able to pass on copies of themselves to my offspring. Occasionally you get selfish genetic elements, so it's not to say that competition is completely absent. Like, you do get selfish genetic elements that will try to overrepresent themselves in the genome, for example, trying to make sure they appear in every sex cell instead of only in 50% and things like that. But by and large, to have those successful transitions, those kinds of competitive selfish interests have to be more or less completely suppressed. And when they are suppressed, that's when we get these, what you might, successful evolutionary transitions in individuality.
That's a very helpful explanation, and it actually raises another question. Just briefly, one of the concepts that has gained a lot of traction in the scientific literature over the past decade or so is this idea of the holobiont. You provide an excellent, thorough description and analysis of the holobiont concept in your book, but it seemed to me, at least, that you refrained from actually endorsing the idea. And so I was hoping you could elaborate on whether you think the holobiont concept deserves all the hype, why or why not.
So the idea of the holobiont is that we have a collection of microbes that live inside our body that in some ways we can think of ourselves and these microbes that we have as being almost like an individual in its own right. And so this is the idea of the holobiont, that we're seeing one of these evolutionary transitions in individuality, and that it's not just me, it's me and all my my hologenome and all my microbes. So I think that there's no doubt that these microbial partners that living beings have are really, really important, and that often those interactions are beneficial, the microbes and the host organism genome are incentivized to work together. But I don't think it really makes sense to think of this as being one of those really important major evolutionary transitions, because there's not that much good evidence that these hologenome, these microbial genomes, are completely reliant on the host organism for their own evolutionary success, for their own evolutionary future. So they can often survive quite well outside the host organism. Sometimes they really do pursue their own interests to the detriment of the host organism. And so I think while that, this is a really cooperative partnership, I don't think there's that really tight interlocking of evolutionary interest that we think is so important for actually facilitating these evolutionary transitions in individuality.
Yeah, it seems like you'll also have a situation with the sort of holobiont idea where, you sort of alluded to this, but you don't have very clear boundaries, right? So like microbes that exist in me, exact same species could exist in both of you. They could transition between existing in me and in you. And so you both, you simultaneously don't have the sort of like locking in of shared fate, and you don't have these clear sort of spatial boundaries.
Yeah, totally. So this idea that of shared fate, that's such a great way of putting it. Like, this is why, the holobiont isn't really like an insect in an insect colony. Like, they aren't totally dependent on the well-being of the host and the survival of the host for their own fortunes.
Right.
Yeah, that was a helpful explanation. I just want to follow up and say I've actually learned a lot. Thank you so much, Dr. Raihani. And thank you, Dr. Tippis, for allowing me to join the conversation.
It's great to have you here with us, Abe. All right, well, Nichola, it's about time for us to start looking to the future of these ideas that we've been talking about and what their implications are for society and the real world more broadly. So here to chat with us about what this all means for future directions is psychologist and evolutionary biologist, Dr. Jessica Ayers. Jessica, great to have you here with us.
Great to be here with you. So I loved this conversation so far. I definitely love this book. That was a little bit of what we were talking about a little bit earlier in the stream. And at least for me, reading the book and then listening to the conversations that have gone on so far, it seems like taking this cooperative perspective of evolutionary biology, not looking necessarily at group selection, like you talked about a little bit earlier about what kind of led you to write this book, that it wasn't just for the betterment of the group led to cooperation. It seems like this cooperative framework is just so much more generative than the more selfish framework in some instances. And so what my first question is kind of, how can we take this really generative perspective and look at all of the similarities and differences across the scaling up of cooperation, from unicellular to multicellular organisms to groups to society, and actually take away some of these principles to foster cooperation within human groups, if you have any insight into that.
I think that's the $1 million question, isn't it? I mean, I always feel a little bit hesitant answering questions like this, because I think if it was easy for us to scale up cooperation in, at large scales in human societies, we would have found ways to do that really reliably. And, we have had some success in that sphere, but also there's lots of instances where we have not succeeded as well. And I think fundamentally it's sort of very difficult to cooperate to generate global benefits. Like what we as a species are pretty good at is cooperating at local scales and cooperating with people we know, with family, or in kind of interactions at a local scale. I think we aren't that great at cooperating to generate global benefits. But I think some of the insights we could take away are some of these ideas that I spoke about when we were talking about major evolutionary transitions. So it's things like shared fate and suppressing competition and ensuring that individuals' interests are aligned in the collective interest and not in their own individual short-term self-interest, but actually like the nuance and the mechanism of how you achieve that in all the different kinds of social problems and social public goods problems that we face. I think there is just no real silver bullet answer to those questions, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it definitely, listening to you talk in this, it really seems like while we take cooperation for granted as being such a fundamental aspect of what it means to be human, the actual nuances and the steps that led to this cooperation are so complex, and they're so much more intricate than we've actually paid attention to, that it also kind of brings up the question of, is cooperation always just something that's really good? Because we're talking about how fundamental it is for human sociality, but cooperation sometimes can do a little bit more harm than good. And so what kind of situations, or is there really a dichotomy between, is cooperation something that's good and cooperation being something that can be bad? Or is it kind of a little bit more complex, like your previous answer kind of suggested?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
want to pull in this comment from the audience for us to kind of look at the same time here. So Tyler Desroches is basically saying, the same thing here, that we think of cooperation as a good thing most of the time, and we hope that it can potentially help us resolve some of these major problems that we're trying to deal with, like anthropogenic climate change. But it is not always directed, cooperation isn't always directed towards good ends, right? It can also be directed towards bad ends. So maybe we can kind of take all of this together in one breath and look at this sort of complex landscape that occurs when we're thinking about and talking about, what cooperation is and what that means for our future as a complex society.
I love this question because I think it's so important. Like, I think there is this sort of view in a way, and it's partly just to do with the language and how we use the word cooperation, that cooperation is this virtuous thing and that it's the solution to all the problems we face. And I think that Tyler is quite right, that actually cooperation is sometimes used for can sometimes generate bad outcomes for some individuals. And in the book, I describe this as being a kind of victims of cooperation, and that cooperation can and frequently does have victims. And this is also something, this is not just a global human societal problem. Like, I don't need to tell you this, obviously, Athena, but this is even something that we see happening inside our own bodies. So, sometimes we see that there will be certain communities of cells that will form partnerships and work together, but which ultimately are detrimental to the host organism. And often the disease that results from those kind of cooperative interactions happening inside our bodies, we would call cancer. And so this is a really well-known example to many of us of hyper-local cooperation happening inside our bodies that nevertheless generates very heavy costs at an individual level. And we
Absolutely.
can see so we can see similar things happening at the societal level too. So things like examples of hyper-local cooperation that nevertheless generate societal costs could be things like corruption and nepotism and bribery. And, if we zoom out a little bit more, warfare and things like that. We see often individuals are pretty good at cooperating locally, but maybe not generating global benefits, but in fact generating global costs. And so the key for us as a species is to work out how we either can incentivize individuals to invest in global interactions and not just local ones, or to co-opt those local scale interactions so that they generate global benefits. And that's what obviously Elinor Ostrom, the Nobel laureate, very famously called thinking global, acting local. And that, kind of plays on our evolved intuitions to interact locally, to cooperate locally. But we need to also be clever about this and to work out how we can do that in a way that doesn't just produce global costs, but actually has some kind of global benefit.
Absolutely. If I can just jump in for a minute, I mean, the example of cancer, I think is such a great example because, what starts out as something that it really seems like it's just cheating in a cooperative system, then if you have those cheaters working together, they can much more effectively exploit this large scale system. And in fact, there are a lot of ways that it's impossible to exploit the body as just one cell. You need to have cells cooperating with their signaling, with their movement, with their, cellular behavior and expression states in order to be able to exploit the body. So I think we see a lot of parallels, to that, like you were saying, with things like corruption and organized crime, right? There are only so many ways that you can, sort of be a cheater as an individual, but to be a cheater as a collective, you have many, many more ways to do that. So yeah, I think it's a fabulous example. And then jumping back to, you mentioned Eleanor Ostrom's idea of, think global, act local. And I was hoping we could maybe, circle in a little bit more with that. She, talks about this idea of polycentric approaches, which you mentioned in your book. What are your thoughts on the value of polycentric approaches for solving some of these issues, or at least getting some traction on them?
In fact, I think the whole concept of polycentricity has a lot to do with what you were just talking about, with diverse communities of cells that are better able to effectively exploit a host organism. And the point here is that diversity breeds resilience, right? So diversity allows you to have many, many different ways of tackling a problem. And it allows you to have some areas where you might fail, but that to cover more bases. So there's more ways that you can potentially succeed as well. And what we see across the tree of life is that the most successful teams are often diverse teams. They're the ones where individuals in the teams have complementary abilities or complementary skills, and that applies as much to cancer as it does to organisms that cooperatively hunt together, and human corporations and things like that. But also in the design of institutions that we have, when we want to tackle problems like climate change and global public goods problems, having a diversity of approaches is a very resilient way to go about doing these things, because you're not putting all the eggs of success in one basket, and you're accepting that yes, some of these things won't work, some of these things will fail, but also you are better able to exploit the whole marketplace of solutions that are available to problems, and to find the ones that do work well as well. So I think that polycentricity is really, really key for us for thinking about how to tackle these kinds of global problems, and in a way that really lends itself to this idea of thinking global, acting local, because it allows many of these different local kind of solutions or approaches to germinate and to be in that system, and each of those things can have a role to play in helping us to kind of solve these big problems.
Yeah, just to kind of put definitional things out there, right? The idea of polycentricity is that you have these different localities that are, coming up with solutions that work in their localities. And then you have also the possibility of sort of regulatory systems happening on these smaller scales, rather than having to have regulatory systems at a higher level that might not be able to take into account the subtleties of what's going on in any particular area. And it sounds like kind of what you're suggesting also is that there's almost an opportunity for cultural evolution here, where it's like, oh, okay, this works here with these kinds of, rules and this kind of ecology, and maybe then that can be adopted elsewhere. And it's exciting to kind of think about, could we be more active about leveraging that kind of process? And I think David Sloan Wilson, among others, are sort of working on how to formalize those kinds of cultural evolution processes around cooperation. So hopefully we'll be able to have him come on a future show and talk more about that.
Great. You should get Michael Krishna as well. He loves to talk about this sort of thing.
Wonderful. Jesse, do you want to jump in with some other questions or comments for Nichola?
Yeah, there's just one kind of question that's still percolating in the back of my head, is with this approach being so incredibly generative, it seems like there are so many potential starting places that new scientists could come in and really hit the ground running with all of this framework that you've really put forth in your book. And so I'm wondering if you could give kind of your perspective on where you think the biggest open questions are, and then specifically, because I am a psychologist, where you think that these questions could really go, and have the most traction for improving human lives kind of very broadly?
Oh, so I think, well, I mean, my sort of parochial research interest is on the role of punishment, and I think there's a lot to do there on, is punishment really as important as we think it is as a mechanism for supporting cooperation, or have we maybe overplayed the importance of punishment? And are some of these other mechanisms that we've spoken about today, so things like partner choice and concern for reputation, are they potentially more important and more sort of positive mechanisms for promoting cooperation? So for me, that's where my research is going, and that's what I'm very interested in. I'm also super interested, again, in something we've talked about, which is how we can, when individuals face trade-offs at the scale at which they cooperate. So if they face trade-offs in terms of investing, say, in a local community or in their neighborhood versus investing in globally in global public goods problems, how do individuals resolve those trade-offs, first of all, and how can we encourage individuals to resolve those trade-offs in favor of generating global benefits and not just local ones? And so I think there's a whole really interesting research agenda there on how scales of cooperation trade off against each other and how we can encourage individuals to cooperate globally. And in terms of like where these things can be useful, I think it's really, there are lots and lots of areas where we face massive social problems and they're problems of failed cooperation. So the obvious ones are things like anthropogenic climate change, loss of biodiversity, pandemics, sharing vaccines, the production of science as a public good. Like, we face these kinds of problems in our daily lives pretty much everywhere. And I think these kind of cooperation framework, or understanding how cooperation evolves, can maybe help us in lots of different fields, global and sort of more local as well.
It's fantastic. It sounds like there's going to be a bunch of new scientists so interested in these ideas after having read your book and listened to you talk about all of the places that you think there's opportunity for future growth in the field more broadly.
Great. Hopefully. Yeah, that would be great. We need it.
Jessie, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts and questions with us. All right. So Nichola, as we've been chatting with Jessie, we had an interesting question come in here from Pam. She's asking whether there's a sort of contagion element to cooperation. Do we tend to cooperate more if people have cooperated with us, or perhaps even if they've cooperated with others? What are your thoughts on the sort of transmissibility of cooperation?
I've never heard cooperation described as a virus before, but I kind of like it. This is a kind of well-known result in the field of cooperation, that individuals we often cooperate conditionally, and we're not the only species that does that. So if an individual has helped us, we will often be more likely to help them in return. And also we do see, like you said, examples of individuals paying it forward. That seems to be a bit more human specific, but there is evidence actually of what we call upstream reciprocity or generalized reciprocity in rats as well, where if one individual does something helpful, then the recipient of that help will then pay that forward and pass that on to another individual. So yeah, you could in some ways describe cooperation as being infectious in that sense, in the sense that there is a conditionality.
Well, maybe there's some hope then. Maybe our next pandemic will be a cooperation pandemic, but at the right scale, right?
Yeah, the right scale. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, Nichola, thank you so much for joining us today. Are there any last thoughts that you'd like to leave us with?
It's been great to be here. Thank you so much for all the interesting questions. And yeah, I hope that if you're really interested in this topic of cooperation and you want to kind of dig a bit deeper into it, then there's a bunch of stuff that I talk about in the book that we haven't talked about today. So things like paranoia and cheating and teaching and what it means to be a family species and the role of mothers and fathers and other family members in raising offspring. So all those kinds of things are all part of the big picture of cooperation. And if you're interested in learning a bit more about that, then by all means, take a look at the book.
Awesome. And the book is The Social Instinct, and people can find that anywhere where they buy books, whether it's a large conglomerate or a small independent bookseller. Depends what kind of level of cooperation you want to support, I guess. So yeah, be sure to grab a copy of The Social Instinct. And Nichola, thank you again so much for your time and your intellectual generosity with us all. It was a real pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you. Thanks, Athena. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
And that about wraps it up for this Cooperation Science Network live stream. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us. Keep your eye out for the date and time for our fall season. Until then, we hope you'll enjoy engaging with our most scientific cooperation and the very best cooperation science. You can follow us on Twitter and stay up to date on all the research that's happening across systems in looking at cooperation. And don't forget, follow us and tag us when you tweet about your cooperation research, so that way we can help spread the word. And subscribe to this YouTube channel. Hit the subscribe button, and if you haven't yet liked us, like us. That'll get us in front of more eyes that are who are interested in these questions about cooperation and how we maintain it and what things can compromise it. So until then, stay cooperative, and we'll see you all next time.